Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, this is James, and welcome to the Mad in America podcast. This is our first episode of 2026, and I'm delighted to be joined by Robert Whitaker. Bob is with us today to answer questions sent in by Mad in America readers. Thank you to all of you who took the time to provide such thought-provoking and important questions. And so, without further ado, let's get going. Bob, welcome. So good to see you again. Thanks for joining me to be on the Mad in America podcast again.
Thank you, James, for this opportunity to interact with Mad in America readers. It's something I look forward to every year. You've sent me some of the questions already, and they're really great questions. And so I think we're going to have a really nice discussion here.
Let's kick off. So, as we said in the introduction, these are all questions submitted by Mad in America readers, listeners. They've come through in various forms. Quite an eclectic mix, I think, of things to ask about. So the first one's from Kristen. And Kristen asks, I'm wondering what you actually think of the ADHD diagnosis. I was put on antidepressants at 13, went through severe withdrawal at age 21, and was misdiagnosed and medicated for bipolar mania for years. Now, in my 30s, I've finally put together that I had ADHD the entire time. No medication works, so I just do without.
Thanks for this question. I mean, the ADHD diagnosis, of course, is in fact a construct. By that, we mean that there was no identification of a pathology or an abnormality in the brain that distinguishes someone, we're going to say, who has ADHD from the non-ADHD person. And basically what you see in terms of the diagnosis is they're just saying that if we give people a survey on how, if they're fidgety, that somehow theoretically measures their attention, and we take those who score at the highest on that scale, and we say, oh, that's the group with ADHD. People who are constructing this can say, oh, it's the people in the top 5%, or the top 10%, or the top 15%, and we'll say that's ADHD. So the first thing that's really important to understand is it's not a diagnosis that has been validated as a true disorder. And when we say validated, there's some genetic component we've identified, that people have identified, or there's some pathological component. Or even, by the way, that people with that diagnosis respond to the drug treatment, stimulants, any different than people without that diagnosis respond to stimulants. And stimulants, of course, have an impact on all who take these drugs. I think the second thing that is important to understand is the method for diagnosing it is very imprecise. If you look at the questions, it's like, how many times a week is a person like this? Or are they, how distractible are they? That sort of thing. So it's a really fungible scale. It's not a precise scale. And so really what ADHD is a way that psychiatry is grouping certain people who say they have difficulty paying attention or staying focused. And the person's own understanding of themselves goes into the diagnosis. So I think that it is important to understand it's a construct. It's not a real disorder. There is no sharp line separating those, quote, with ADHD from those without ADHD. If for Kristen, this sense of having this difficulty is helpful to her, great. Okay, that's okay. Especially since she's not finding that the solution is a drug treatment. Because when we look at people who get this diagnosis and then go down the medicated route, you really don't see good long-term outcomes. You see a lot of adverse events related to use of stimulants. So here at MIA, we always want to be respectful of individuals who find something helpful to them. And it sounds like Kristen has found that the diagnosis in some ways is helpful to explain her life. But I think it is also helpful for society at large to understand that it is a construct. There's no genetic thing that shows that it's separate from non-ADHD. There's no known pathology. There's no known specific response to stimulants. And that is just this way of sort of identifying people who say they lack focus or get distracted easily.
Thanks, Bob. That's helpful. And I was wondering, as a kind of add-on to that, obviously, ADHD always used to be something that was talked about in relation to kids, particularly young kids at school, inattention, that kind of stuff. But in recent years, there's been an explosion, it seems, in diagnoses of adult ADHD. So, I just wonder, is there really any difference between the diagnoses used to diagnose a kid with attention problems and an adult with attention problems, or are they just broadly the same kind of construct?
As you say, James, initially it was seen as a diagnosis for youth in school. And really, kids who weren't doing so well in school, didn't thrive in the school environment. Maybe they were bored or whatever. But you have to look at the larger story here. And the larger story is how psychiatric diagnoses and drug treatments have been marketed all the way back to 1980, when the American Psychiatric Association published the third edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. This is when they said, we're going to adopt a disease model, and we're going to say that these problems reside in the head of the individual, and we have these drug treatments that are specific to them. And that was a story that led to the great expansion of the psychiatric enterprise, people getting diagnosed with depression, anxiety, bipolar, ADHD, that sort of thing. But this is a commercial story, okay? So it was a commercial story that basically helped sell drugs to youth that were struggling a little bit. And then what happened with ADHD diagnosis, the makers of stimulants for ADHD drugs said, oh, that market is getting saturated. How about we move into the adult market? And so they began promoting this idea with prescribers and to the public at large, that adult ADHD was real too. And now all of a sudden, adults were given an explanation for some of their difficulties in life. Maybe they didn't like their job, or they said they couldn't stay focused on one thing. But it's taking the same construct and peddling it to adults is what it is. And in a way, what you see is it's a construct that tells people this is why you're struggling with life. Whereas maybe in the past we said, well, life is difficult, and maybe I'm in situations which make it difficult to thrive in. So it's really a change in conception and thinking, but it definitely has a commercial influence and drive towards the whole thing. So your question is a great one. And really, if you want to understand the ADHD diagnosis, you have to see how it was first promoted to youth, first to boys, then to girls, and then to adults. And through that marketing lens, it can all make sense.
Understood. Thanks, Bob. That's really clear. Okay, moving on to the next one. So this is Larry. And Larry says, generally speaking, our understanding of the psyche is woefully inadequate. This must be one reason why psychiatry remains a false profession. How far are you willing to go in your research or on the Mad in America website to begin a discussion along these lines?
Well, I think it's a discussion that we've been having ever since we started Mad in America in January of 2012. Because, of course, we've had bloggers talk about phenomenological conceptions of the psyche. And we've had many, many, many blogs and people writing about how the mind responds to the environment, that sort of thing. And in essence, with the medical model, the disease model we're criticizing, that's a very reductionist model of the psyche, that's just we're sort of puppets of our neurotransmitters. A main theme of Mad in America from the beginning is how that construct, that belief system, that model is not science-based, but it's not based in what we know from philosophy, what we know from religion, what we know from literature, and all these other explorations, in essence, of the psyche and how human beings move throughout the world. So I think actually this has been a fundamental aspect of Mad in America from the beginning, of saying what a mystery the psyche is. It's a very complex place. It's not easily defined. So my response is this has been part of us from the beginning. It's providing an alternative to the reductionist disease model. And once you provide an alternative, you get into this, what is the psyche? How is it that consciousness arises? How is it that we feel emotions? And I do think that once you ask that question, it's a question that has persisted throughout time, throughout human history. So I hope that makes sense. Great question. I think it's central to what we do, but we are approaching this humbly, with humility, because the reason they're approaching this with humility is the mind is such a complex, mysterious place. And if you don't approach it with humility, you start falling into the same trap that psychiatry has done when it starts saying, oh, we know about the brain and the mind. It's just all involved with these neurotransmitter levels. We can't critique that without the humility of approaching the human mind, saying, wow, what a complex place. What a mystery. And yes, it's worthy of thinking about, but let's not pretend that we have the answers to explain that human consciousness and that human experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Bob. And I'd agree, to me, reading Mad in America doesn't feel like reading a medical journal. It's much richer than that. Almost every week there are articles that consider philosophy, religion, social studies, how we relate to each other as humans, community, all that kind of stuff. So it feels very different, I think, to just, the hard medical facts you might read if you visit, I don't know, some of the top medical journals.
Yeah, and that's because in essence, Mad in America's understanding is that this part of our lives, of suffering and difficulties, it really doesn't fit into a neat medical context. That's the point. It really fits into a larger context of like, what does it mean to be human? What is the spectrum of experiences? We're trying to have this very complex, broad exploration of this world we live in.
Okay, moving on. So Dan asks, why is it that doctors aren't taught or educated about the side effects and withdrawal risks regarding antidepressants? And also, what is the longest period that you know of that someone has waited before reinstating their drug successfully?
Okay, I'm not sure I understand the second part of that question. We can talk about the first part. Why aren't doctors taught about withdrawal problems and how to get people on? Because that whole discussion undercuts the conventional narrative that has been promoted to us by the Psychiatric Guild and by pharmaceutical companies that these are safe and effective drugs. So when people go through their medical training, conventional understanding is that these are safe and effective drugs, okay? And that they help people. And there's even sort of an understanding if they're safe and effective that you're not going to talk about changes in the brain that lead to withdrawal symptoms. Okay, just doesn't enter that conventional narrative. So that's why the conventional narrative, which arose from the Guild and from pharmaceutical companies, wants to tell a story of people being helped and their lives improved by these drugs. If you start focusing on the difficulty coming off and persistent withdrawal symptoms and why that is happening, meaning because the drug has changed your brain, you get a totally different conception about the risks of using these drugs in the first place. So medical training is really formed by that commercial influence and that commercial story and training people in that story. And of course, it's pitched as a story of medicine and science, but really you have to take a step back and look at the financial influences behind that story. And we all know that the market for psychiatric drugs is a big one, okay? And they have a story that is necessary in order to sell those drugs to the public. The withdrawal information doesn't fit within that positive story.
SSRIs were seen, weren't they, as such an advance over barbiturates and tricyclic antidepressants that, the whole story that went with them was that in every way, shape or form, they were a much better way to treat people with depression.
They were an antidote. They were fixing a chemical imbalance in the brain, so they were specific to a problem that was causing depression. So once you have that out there, you're really going to now start telling people, but wait a minute, actually these drugs induce a chemical imbalance, and that's why you have trouble coming off, and we're perturbing normal functioning. It doesn't fit with the story that was told, you're right, when Prozac was launched in 1988.
As to the second part of Dan's question, I think what he's asking here is when someone has come off their antidepressant, they may have tapered, they may have come off quite suddenly. Some people then are forced to go back on. They're forced to reinstate because they think it might be their only way of addressing the withdrawal symptoms. So I think Dan's interested in, do you know of people that have waited quite a long time before reinstatement and, whether that was successful or not? I mean, I do know, for example, I think Stuart Shipko, we've interviewed him a couple of times. He's written for Mad in America quite often. I think his view is the longer you wait to reinstate, the less likely you are to get relief because your body is attempting to readjust to its pre-drug state. But I think Dan's just asking, are you aware of people where there's been quite a gap between them coming off their drug and maybe having to go back on to try and manage withdrawal symptoms?
In a way, I'm hesitant to answer this because there's nothing in the psychiatric literature that answers this question. There's nothing. You're not going to find this sort of question. And this sort of shows the absence of information regarding the whole experience once you've been on these drugs and tried to come off, okay? The first answer to this is, I don't know, okay? But I think what you said, I think there is some sense that, and I certainly heard this from people, that the longer they've come off and still having some persistent difficulties and try and reinstate, often the reinstatement, they're not getting any sort of even immediate boost. But I don't really know anything about the longest that anyone has been able to reinstate and have a benefit. I just don't know of that. You know this better than I do, James, honestly, about the whole withdrawal stories. But it does point to the question. We have this whole area of experience now. People been on antidepressants for a long time and other psychiatric drugs, but particularly antidepressants and SSRIs. And we see all these accounts of how difficult it is, right? For many people, and how symptoms may persist, and about different strategies for trying to get off. But it's all bubbling up from the grassroots. It's bubbling up from, people sharing lived experience stories. The amount of information trying to really categorize these problems, attempts to really understand them, is so minimal. It's a black hole. Dan's question goes really into that black hole.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I completely understand and sympathize with those people out there that are desperately seeking some relief from their dreadful symptoms. But as you say, it's a complete lottery, and we know that because for some people, they can switch these drugs on and off, stop them suddenly, and have almost no problems at all. They don't even notice. They might forget to take one and not even notice any problems. And yet other people take them for a really short weeks, and then try and stop after weeks, suffer dreadful symptoms for, weeks, months, years, whatever it may be. So it really is a lottery, isn't it?
It's just a lottery in terms of response to the drug in the first place. There'll be a spectrum of responses, some good, say antidepressants, some just nothing, and then some worsening, even on the response. And then, as you say, in terms of people's experiences withdrawing, is some people can get off these quite easily and fast. Others, no. It is a lottery, and maybe that would be really helpful in terms of, as we sort of probe or write about this, is you need to put out right front and center. It is a lottery. It's not one experience fits all. Far from it.
Okay, thanks, Bob. And on to the next one then. So Deezer asks, how do we come up with a plan to demand that Marty Makary at the FDA addresses the scandal that is ECT?
This is really an important question and a good question. It's really pretty remarkable because the evidence that ECT causes brain damage is overwhelming. And it goes all the way back to the 1940s. They understood it was like this ACT did something similar to a closed head injury. A closed head injury is a concussion. Okay, so you don't see a gash or a break in the skull, okay? But we all know that concussions are bad for you, right? And concussions one of the things is they can start to impair memory if you have a number of them. We understand that football players, professional football players, often end up with closed head injuries, concussions, etc., that have horrible long-term effects, behavior control, suicidal impulses, that sort of thing. So here we have a so-called therapy that we know, in fact, causes memory, among other problems. It causes memory loss, okay? That's a sign you're damaging the brain. That's the only way to put it. So it is a brain-damaging therapy. That's number one. Second of all, it's not effective as for curing depression over a long period of time. So what happens with ECT? You suffer this blow to the brain, right? And there is some sense that if you are out there in the real world and you have some sort of closed head injury, you often aren't depressed afterwards because the body floods yourself with these sort of hormonal response that are meant to repair injuries and that sort of thing. But does that last? And as far as I know, if you look at beyond 30 days, there's really no evidence that ECT provides relief from depression, which is usually what it's given for. And next thing you know, it's not like you're given one ECT. I'm pretty sure this is the same in the UK. You're given a series of ECTs. And sometimes it'll be 6, sometimes it'll be 12, sometimes it'll be more than that. So how do we get Macari or the FDA to respond to this? Where I've seen sort of critiques of ECT be successful, and they were successful in California, for example, in the 1970s, you had psychiatric survivor groups really making a campaign against ACT. It's somehow making known to the larger public that this is a brain-damaging therapy. Memory loss is just not a minor thing. It's central to who we are as human beings. It's central to how we humans go about our lives. We treasure our memories. So we're harming a central core of what it means to be human. So we need to make that clear. And then if we move into the evidence-based place, right, that whether or not if it's effective, we need to make it clear that it's really not effective over the long term, over past 30 days. Now, John Reed, of course, has been campaigning like this, he and his group in the UK for years, and they've got a lot of papers that are coming out. And somehow, and we do this at Mad in America, we publicize this research, and we need to make this research known and part of a core element in our consciousness, in our public consciousness, right? And then we need a petition. We need to do a big petition, put a petition up on, say, change.org and get 50,000 signatures and send it to the FDA. I think that's the best process, plan. And of that petition, have it include a number of people who've had ECT and can speak to the harm it did to their lives. And again, though, you have the Guild who's telling a different story about how this is, in fact, such a wonderfully effective treatment for those who don't respond to drugs. That's the battle we have to do.
Yeah, it strikes me that personal testimony is incredibly important here, isn't it? Because, in the responses from psychiatry that I've seen to critique of ECT, they seem to be saying the people that have suffered damage are the outliers. They seem to be trying to convince people that only a very small number of people have negative outcomes and the other people go on to lead successful lives after the procedure. But, when these things are studied, that doesn't seem so clear.
First of all, you see persistent memory problems when you actually study for it. You don't see that just outliers. You see it as, a principal part of what happens, especially after a series of these things, okay? So it is not a rare adverse event. It is a common impact of having it done, okay? So it's a primary effect. James, what you're speaking about, here's the problem. To be honest with you, the Guild, in essence, is a propaganda machine. It's always defending what it does, regardless of what the evidence actually shows.
This next one is kind of related to the ECT discussion as well, really, and it's from Mary. And Mary says, can you comment on the split between psychiatry and neurology? This is strange considering how psychiatry is so focused on the brain. What about traumatic brain injury or chronic traumatic encephalopathy? Suppose psychiatric issues might actually be from a brain injury of some kind. Where is MIA on all of this? So again, this speaks to brain injury and, whether we cause that by either by use of medications or use of electroshock or whatever else it might be.
Well, first of all, there are brain injuries that lead to psychiatric symptoms, like traumatic brain injury, that sort of thing. You can have loss of emotional control. There's infectious illnesses that lead to psychiatric symptoms. Syphilis is well known. If it's not treated, end-stage syphilis had, psychotic symptoms involved. Parkinson's disease, for example, long-term often leads to psychotic symptoms. Inflammation of the brain clearly can lead to psychiatric issues. Things we call psychiatric issues, whether it be depression, anxiety, lack of impulse control, that sort of thing. So those things, I actually think what you need, And once upon a time, this is how psychiatry responded to things, is if you see people with these symptoms, the first thing you should be doing is physical workups to see if these other physical causes are present as much as possible. And that used to be the case. It used to be understood you'd give a physical workup to see, like, is there a physical problem, a neurological problem causing these, what we see as psychiatric difficulties? And what happened was this. There was a long-standing split between psychiatry and neurology, with the understanding really was that things that had a specific understood biological cause, when that happened, they moved into the realm of neurology. And therefore, what you needed was a medical response, if you could. Let's say Parkinson's as a treatment, or whether inflammation of the brain or something. It's not about treating the psychiatric symptoms. It's about treating whatever the neurological disorder is, or the infectious disease disorder. Then what happens, though, in 1980 is the American Psychiatric Association adopts this disease model. And now it's going to say that those psychiatric symptoms are their own disease, okay? And that's what we treat. And we're not going to look for these neurological things because we see these symptoms themselves as elements of discrete diseases. And so this leads to a horrible outcome where people with a neurological problem, then that goes undiagnosed if they first show up at the psychiatrist's office. And now what happens is they're getting treated for these psychiatric symptoms with psychiatric drugs, which basically just add to their difficulties, their neurological difficulties, their functioning of their brain. So this is part of the real reason the disease model has failed, because it has eliminated all of these biological pathways to psychiatric symptoms. And there clearly are biological pathways. Then there are, other pathways. There are social pathways. There are psychological problems. There are traumatic pathways as well. But now that distinction has been blurred, okay, much to the detriment of our society. So bottom line is psychiatry has crowded in on neurology and tried to grab these patients for themselves. And that has been done much to the detriment of the population because it blurs this necessary understanding of a distinction between the two.
Okay, moving on. So the next one is from Trin, and this came through Facebook. And Trin says, is there any new research being done about what actually gets damaged in the body and brain and nerves when a person has injury from taking or withdrawing from psychiatric medications?
So this is a great question, and it leads to an answer that says we need precisely that. We need now research focused on in what way do the drugs, in fact, cause harm to the brain, cause malfunctioning of the brain, and changes in the brain that may persist, or changes to the nervous system and the regulation of the nervous system that may persist even after drug withdrawal. We're getting clear signs that, in fact, that you are causing a dysregulation of the nervous system, some sort of both neuronal and nerve injury that persists in some people even after they withdraw from the medications. And it seems to be particularly pronounced with the SSRIs, even more than the antipsychotics. Although we know that antipsychotics can cause tardive dyskinesia, which persists afterwards, which is a sign of a dysregulation of the dopamine system. But why don't we have that? Because there is no financial drive for looking at the harms of these drugs. Drug companies aren't interested in it. American Psychiatric, the Guild's not interested because that would be criticizing their own products, right? So where is the money going to come from? And say like the NIMH is promoting mental health access. It's promoting mental health treatments. It doesn't want to start funding, or that's not motivated to fund things of harms from mental health treatment, psychiatric. So we lack in society those forces that would help us investigate and do research on basically drug-caused injury, prescribed drug-caused injury. It's something we need desperately. You can see there's a need for it. It's clear there is, with the persistent withdrawal symptoms, a neuronal injury that's happening, a nervous system injury that's happening. And unfortunately, while there is this bubbling up from grassroots saying this is what appears to be happening. We don't have a mechanism in our society for investigating drugs through that lens of what harm are they doing, which really would be like a neurological injury lens. That's what we need, but we don't have it.
It's so desperately needed because, if you are someone that's experienced withdrawal and you try and look up any official guidance about what might be going on, typically you'll see something that says something like you might experience flu-like symptoms. And yet, when you talk to people who have experienced it, they're having stomach problems, paresthesias, sleeping problems, balance problems, gait problems. I mean, just the whole gamut of things. And I have never personally had flu that's caused that wide range of things. So the flu-like symptoms thing goes nowhere near explaining how widespread the effects of withdrawal and post-withdrawal can be. And the poor people that go to their doctor with these things, they end up, falling into groups with chronic fatigue type people and fibromyalgia and other kind of non-specified functional problems where the doctor's trying to say this is just you, this is nothing to do with the drug. So you're right, we absolutely do need more research on this.
And what you just described is a story of an iatrogenic injury. It's an injury to the nerve system. The nerve system is no longer able to regulate itself or perform its normal functions, the skin crawling, everything you say. So this is a profound injury to the system that developed throughout evolution, enabling us to sort of move about our environment. That shows how profound this injury is. It's it's an injury to a bodily system that is so critical to our ability to function in society. It should be front and center of any investigation that needs to be done today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Bob. And moving on, this next one's from Facebook, from Greet, and again is related really, really nicely to how widespread, nervous system injury is in drug withdrawal. So Greet says, how common is it to get post-SSRI sexual dysfunction, PSSD, and heal from it? It's a horrible existence without emotions, love, good cognition, and sexuality.
I sought to write a magazine article on PSSD in 2011. And I did write it. I interviewed people with it. And as this person says, it's a horrible thing. It's because it's not just sexual dysfunction. It's like an inability to respond to mount an emotional response to the world itself, like to the beauty of a rainbow, to art, to really become emotionally engaged with another human being. So it's not just that you have some impairment of sexual functioning. It's your impairment of an ability to engage emotionally with the world, which is very, very profound. Now, when I did this in 2011, it was basically almost not on the radar, and the magazine finally wouldn't publish it because I looked at how it was funded and they had all these pharmaceutical ads. At that time, it seemed like maybe 25% of people actually had some sort of PSSD after they came off. And then there was varying times of recovery from that. Some people did seem to get it back after a year, or 6 months after a year. Some people resolved after a couple of years, and some people it seemed not to resolve at all. Now, the other element that I remember from this is it was particularly prevalent in kids who were put on SSRIs during their formative development of their puberty. That they had an extra risk of developing this. But it could also happen to people who went on antidepressants as adults, and particularly with the SSRI antidepressants. So how common is it? It's at last being acknowledged as something that can happen even within the field. They're, of course, downplaying it. There was a recent New York Times article on this, which I forget what they said was sort of semi-rare idea, like maybe 2%, 5%. That was basically it. Well, like all these things, the true prevalence is much higher. They don't want to admit it. The powers that be want to underplay. First thing is we don't know the prevalence. My sense is that it is indeed higher for those who are put on antidepressants and SSRIs in puberty. And now, what is the recovery rate? We don't know. Has been well studied. We also don't know the mechanism of the injury, right? So how long does it take sometimes to heal from injuries of this type? And often you can, in nature, heal from these injuries, and it seems very variable. And I would say it seems some people it can happen in months, some people a year or more, some people a couple years. I do remember there was some research done not research, sort of patient surveys done in the UK that said after 5 years, most people seem to have resolved. And then there are some people that honestly, it seems like they never get it back. And hopefully that is I'm talking about their sexual function as emotional response. Hopefully that's a very small percentage. One wishes it were zero. But the mere fact we don't know with this question is telling us that it's like a canary in the coal mine question. We should be investigating this. And as you know, David Healy has a prize out there for anyone who can really help explicate the nature of the injury, the physiological nature of the injury. But we really don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, one of the things that strikes me is if you do go on forums for PSSD, when new people arrive to try and find out a bit more about what's going on with them, you know, they'll have found this forum on Facebook or, you know, Reddit or whatever else, you know, and they'll say, one, that they had no idea that antidepressants could affect your sexuality in any way at all. And secondly, that if they have gone to their doctor or psychiatrist to say they've got sexual difficulties, they are inevitably told that it's a function of your depression.
Yeah, this goes back to the original report of adverse effects with the SSRIs. There was actually a lot of sexual dysfunction apparent, but what they did is they attributed it all to the disorder and not to the drug. And so when they first came out, it was like, oh, maybe 1% have sexual dysfunctions, 3 sexual, that is drug related. But really it's the disorder, not the drug. This just goes back to like how we have a narrative fashioned by protectors of the drugs. And this is a longstanding thing, is they assign it to the disease. I'm not saying depression is a disease, but in their mind, the disease and not the drug. And again, this is part of the extraordinary betrayal of this. And James, as you know, we've had personal stories, a number of personal stories on Mad in America that tell of people their struggles with PSSD. And you know what the stories are? They're heartbreaking. They're utterly heartbreaking because they tell people who feel like they've lost their ability to engage in life in full way. And if we go back to initial non-industry funded trials of the SSRIs, you know what they said was the incident on drug of sexual dysfunction? Anywhere from 50 to 90%, depending on how you defined it. Now, the irony is, one of the things that showed up here was men took longer to ejaculate. So, and this is obviously a sign that you're disrupting things in a way, but they say, oh, great, now we can market it for premature ejaculation. So we can take this adverse event and put it to use for those people have this difficulty making love. This, again, it's like this betrayal of the public's right to know about the risks and benefits. And it goes back to the marketing of these drugs, the selling of these drugs, which came out through a collaboration between the pharmaceutical companies and the psychiatric guilds. They have betrayed the public because they have not been willing to address these harms and willing to focus on these harms. And instead they have hidden these harms.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Bob. And, you know, just to reiterate that if people out there do want to know more about what we do or don't know about PSSD, then if you go to Mad in America and search for PSSD, as Bob said, you'll find personal stories and you'll find research news articles where we've looked at, you know, what any official reports say. So it might be worth having a look there if people are interested.
Right. And those stories, we'll talk about surveys of prevalence too as well, so you can get an update on that.
Okay, thank you. And on to our last question. And this one, Bob, if you'll indulge me, is actually from me. And it's kind of based upon my, the changes that I've seen in Mad in America over the years that I've been involved. So I joined Mad in America in 2017. That's when the podcast kicked off. And in the kind of intervening years, it's been obvious that the way that people produce and consume news is changing, really. And so what I wanted to ask is, how does Mad in America compete in a world of shorter attention spans and sensationalized clickbait competition? Because refuting misinformation needs time and space. It doesn't really easily fit into a social media landscape. And, psychiatry can use catchy slogans, as it did with the chemical imbalance myth. Countering that requires evidence. So how can critics respond to propaganda with scientific and intellectual rigor while having to compete in a market that's flooded with AI-generated slop and fact-free soundbites?
Well, trying to respond to all the slop and the propaganda is like whack-a-mole. Because it's coming up every day and it's just constant, okay? I'm going to go to the first part of your question, and that is how people consume information today. And it is certainly, and also now in the era of AI, it certainly has changed. And it has changed in the way that there's just this flood of information out there now, and flood of sound bites, and flood on social media, and people coming to web magazines to read is actually, that's becoming less and less in a way. You can see a drop off in people going to websites, media websites, because they're getting their information in these bits and pieces through other forms, whether it be Instagram, X, or text and that sort of thing. So what do? And, we recognize that we have a challenge in this changing landscape for media. We have to see Mad in America as how can we deliver an insightful and in-depth understanding, and which means a narrative that helps us understand like where diagnoses come from, what do drugs do? What are the outcomes? And what are the alternatives? And really, when you talk about those different facets, it's like, how can we give them a different narrative for understanding what has been in the past, what led us to this point, and what narrative can guide us in the future? Because people in societies organize themselves around a narrative. So, and again, in a certain sense, is what we want to do is help people understand that the disease model that has governed our thinking is a failed model of care in every way, scientific and in outcomes, and then help them see these possibilities of a different narrative. And we talked about like a narrative that is not rooted in the disease conception of the brain. So how do we do that? Well, what we're going to be doing is basically having more of our own sort of content that is originated within MIAs that we really help flesh out this narrative. That means in terms of both our science reports, even the essays. So fewer blogs that just come in over the transom, but really more in-depth essays. Our science reports are going to move from less sort of, this is what happened in this study and here's how it was done, into how whatever is appearing in the research literature fits into broader themes, evolving themes, involving understanding, say, withdrawal symptoms and alternatives, that sort of thing. So that's what you're going to see in the coming year, James, is we're going to see, by the way, we're going to see more MI radio podcasts, because the podcasts are a great forum for exploring these ideas, not just telling of what is people know, but exploring all these things and learning from them and engaging an audience in the exploration of these things. So we're going to be doing more MI radio podcasts. We may even increase the frequency of our personal stories, and then more of these in-depth MIA reports of larger themes. So we're going to be spending more of our energy, in fact, more of our funding on original content that we are generating ourselves or our freelancers are generating under our editorial control. And one of the reasons we want to do this is because we understand that readers, rather than come to us every day for the daily update, will hopefully be visiting us like once a week to see like what are the nuggets, the themes that have been published here that can help them continue to have their own narrative understanding evolve of these big picture. So more in-depth features, more content that really we are controlling. That's the idea. And It is in response to a changing landscape for media websites. And I think in order to continue to have a claim on the public, you really got to help them solidify a new narrative for what was wrong and also what is possible. And it's a new narrative both for themselves personally, themselves professionally, and for how society can think about these things.
I look forward to those changes, Bob. My reflection on it is I think what I enjoy about reading MIA articles or being involved with the podcast is that you get to understand people's thought process of how they came to a conclusion about a particular issue. That's not what you get from AI. Yeah, you can type in a Google search and you can get a 3-line answer to a question, but it tells you nothing about how that answer was arrived at. The way the answer was arrived at is a critical part of the understanding of why this issue might have changed or might not be what we think it is. And I think that's what MIA, through its stories, through its personal stories, its science news and the podcasts, I think that's what MIA can provide.
Yeah, I love that idea that, there's a complexity to how we think about things and how we arrive at conclusions and how we experience the world. And we want to honor that complexity and reflect that complexity and reflect that process. So that's certainly our goal. It is a challenge in this time of 2-second, social media bursts and all this sort of stuff. And as you say, the fact that AI can regurgitate information so quickly and people are starting to rely on that. This is one of the things people say, like, oh, I'll ask a question of AI, then I don't have to go to media websites and they'll just regurgitate to me. Well, people do need to understand that's a regurgitation. It's not original thinking. It's not process thinking. And hopefully people understand what AI is really about. It is about regurgitating other data without any sort of, well, that's what it does. It regurgitates stuff.
Yeah. I think it was Frank Zappa that said information is not knowledge.
Yes. Yes. And this isn't even very complete information. But anyway, that's another story.
So that's it for the questions. Thank you, Bob. I think people sent in some great questions, and I thank you so much for your generosity in giving us so much time to talk through them. And, I really do look forward to what sounds like a kind of new chapter for Mad in America, one driven out of necessity, but even so, I look forward to seeing how Mad in America develops over 2026 and beyond.
Well, first of all, necessity hopefully is an opportunity for change and the mother of invention. So hopefully we're following that in that path. I just want to say it's really a pleasure being here on this podcast at the end of the year and a chance to hear from our readers with all these great questions. And I think at least I saw that the questions really were provocative, and which is what we need. So I want to thank our listenership for, providing us with these questions and this opportunity. And thank you. And it's been great having this chance to interact with those questions today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you, James. Real pleasure.
So thank you so much for listening today. Please keep an eye on madinamerica.com for news and updates. And until next time, take care.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.